the Elizabethan age, the prose in the Elizabethan period. And there is actually this particular text, as you can see here, D.H. Lawrence, the Rocking Horse Winner. This has been replaced. So this is no longer in your syllabus. What you will have to study instead is Dream Children a Reverie by Charles Lamb. So that would be the essay that you will have to study instead of D.H. Lawrence's The Rocking Horse Winner. Now from these 6 or 5 texts, I'll be doing this Jhumpa Lahiri's A Temporary Matter. So I'll be doing with you this particular text after I finish doing with you Elizabethan prose. So this is the syllabus for semester 2 DSC 2, that is, and you will be having another paper, that is digital empowerment. This is the paper that you are going to have. You have to study for ACC 2, ACC for semester 2 digital empowerment. So the syllabus actually it is not mentioned here, but we will be doing that also, covering that also. So let us begin with our study of Elizabethan prose. Let us study that. I will share the PPT with you. Hopefully you can see this PPT. Okay, can you see everyone? সবাই দেখতে পাচ্ছ তো এটা? Now since we have to do Elizabethan prose, now first we need to know about the period. Now of course, as you know, that this particular period of English literature is designated as the Elizabethan period because it was named after Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned in England from 1558 to 1603. So that is the time period when Queen Elizabeth ruled England, and from that actually it has come to be known as the Elizabethan period. Now before the Elizabethan age, there were certain prose writers like, for example, George Gascoigne, Thomas More, but since we will be studying the writers from the Elizabethan age itself, we will have to concentrate on the writers who are actually from the Elizabethan age, who belong to the Elizabethan age. Now let us move on to the PPT, and the first prose writer who we will be concentrating on is Sir Francis Bacon. His dates are 1561 to 1626. Now I will give you actually I have written here some of the important works that Sir Francis Bacon had written, and as you can see here, some of his important works are The Advancement of Learning, Novum Organum, Instauratio Magna, or the Great Institution of True Philosophy, the Essays, the New Atlantis, and the History of Henry VII. So these are some of the important works of Sir Francis Bacon. Now I will talk about these works, and in brief, of course, because we have to deal with a number of writers during this Elizabethan period. Now, this particular work, the advancement of learning, actually it was a kind of a work where Sir Francis Bacon had was actually enunciating his philosophy, and it was published in the year 1605. So Sir Francis Bacon's first work of significance was the advancement of learning. Now, if you look at this particular work, that is the second one, that is Novum Organum. The Novum Organum is actually a Latin work. Sir Francis Bacon wrote most of his works in Latin, though of course he wrote the essays in English and the advancement of learning in English. Now, Novum Organum is actually means, it translated into English, it means the new instrument. The new instrument, that is, Bacon had thought of trying to use reason and experimentation, reasoning and experimentation, instead of the old Aristotelian logic. So he said that in order to do this, one has to do two things. Firstly, one has to get rid of all prejudices and all kinds of preformed ideas, and also after discarding them, people should try to interrogate, should try to question nature. So that is the way facts can be collected. So Novum Organum is this kind of a work, and you will find that here Sir Francis Bacon was talking about this particular way of gaining knowledge through reasoning and experimentation. Now the third one, that is C, that is written here, Instauratio Magna, or the Great Institution of True Philosophy. So this is actually a larger work. This was in fact incomplete. It was aimed at a new philosophy which would substitute, or which would replace that of the schoolmen, the philosophy of the schoolmen and the educational systems of the universities. So it would be a kind of a storehouse for the glory of the Creator and for the relief of man's estate. And Bacon, what he wanted to do, actually, he wanted to bring practical results to all the people through this kind of through this book. So this is the Great Institution of True Philosophy, and this was actually divided into 6 parts. And Novum Organum, or the new instrument, was one part. The other parts were different ones which remained incomplete. They were not completed by Bacon. Now, before going on to the essays, I will refer to the book, The New Atlantis. The New Atlantis by Bacon. Now, The New Atlantis was also unfinished, and it was a philosophical romance modeled upon Thomas More's famous book, Utopia. Now, Utopia, Thomas More's work, it was actually, utopia means an ideal state. So, Thomas More, in his book, Utopia, he had talked about an ideal state. And Bacon here, in the New Atlantis, he was actually trying to follow Thomas More's example. Now, the last mentioned work, The History of Henry VII. The History of Henry VII, actually, it was another example of his historical work, which was published in 1622. But nowadays, Bacon is remembered for his essays, not for these books, neither for the advancement of learning, nor for Instauratio Magna, or the New Atlantis, or the History of Henry VII, but he is remembered for his essays. Now, as you saw in your DSC-2 syllabus, you have one of his essays in your syllabus, and that is a very famous essay, Of Studies. So, Of Studies, it is a very brief essay. It is a brief essay, but it is full of advice that Bacon gives his readers as to the kind of books that one should choose. Now, all his essays belong with this word of. So, some of the very famous essays are of life, of death, of love. Then there are different essays which belong with this word of. And these essays were 58 in number. There is an interesting change. There is an interesting change in their number. Actually, his essays first appeared in 1597, and then they were only 10 in number. There were only 10 essays when it was first published in the year 1597. But in the second edition in 1612 and in the third edition 1625, the number was raised to 38 and finally to 58. Now, what are these essays on? What are the subjects of these essays? Now, Bacon has chosen for his subjects, the subjects of his essays, such familiar subjects as learning, studies, vainglory, great place, and I have mentioned death, love, friendship, such essays. So these are not very long essays. I would ask you to read some of them. His essays are, the collection is quite easily available online, so you can just download one copy and you can read some of the essays which really would interest you because of the diversity of the subjects, and you will be really interested. If you read one or two essays, you will feel like reading the whole array of essays. So I'll ask you to read some of these essays, and really very sound advice has been given by Sir Francis Bacon. So this is the first prose writer that we are dealing with, Sir Francis Bacon. And this was a kind of a, though it was written in English, these essays, actually they are very terse and they are very full of thought, and they were, you can say, quite intelligent advice for people. Now, regarding Bacon's style, we can say that Bacon's style was it was in fact quite somewhat terse, and he was in fact, as a philosopher, we can say that he was one of the founders of modern systematic thought. And we can see that the English prose style was beginning to thrive under Bacon. And the style is very crisp, it is detached and epigrammatic. So each essay actually arises from a particular thought or feeling, and the ideas are expanded, and they are very much impersonal. They are very much impersonal, meaning they are objective in style. That is, the Bacon, the man, his personal likes or dislikes are not mentioned in the essays. So he is giving us advice, but in a very detached, in a very sort of aloof fashion. That is what he is doing. And he is writing in a kind of in the language of ordinary men, and he takes some imageries from everyday life. So that is what he does. So this is the works of Sir Francis Bacon, who is the first Elizabethan prose writer that we have dealt with. Now let us move on to the next ones. The next one is Richard Hooker, 1554 to 1600. Now Richard Hooker actually was very much in contrast. His style was very much in contrast to Sir Francis Bacon, and of course he was also one of the well-known and famous prose writers of the Elizabethan age. And we can say that in his most famous work, which is this, The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, this is his work, The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, and it was actually a work which had for its theme the law and practice of the English Church. So it was a religious work, as you can see, and it was a theological and argumentative work, and it is really an example of the stateliness of the English language. And of course, as we can see here, Richard Hooker, his style was also quite lofty, and the ideas were well explained by the writer. And I will read just one small paragraph from this work so as to give you an idea about Richard Hooker's style. So let us read one little paragraph from this book called The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Quote, "Of law there can be no less acknowledged than that her seat is the bosom of God, her voice the harmony of the world. All things in heaven and earth do her homage, the very least as feeling her care, and the greatest as not exempted from her power. Both angels and men, and creatures of what condition soever, though each in different sort and manner, yet all with uniform consent, admiring her as the mother of their peace and joy." Unquote. So here in this passage, Richard Hooker is actually talking about the fact that law or religious law comes from the bosom of God, that is directly from God, and it should be regarded as such. So this is the laws of ecclesiastical polity as enunciated in the by Richard Hooker, one of the greatest prose writers of the Elizabethan age. Now, the next writer, of course, is Sir Philip Sidney. Now, Sir Philip Sidney actually was a poet. He is more known as a poet than as a prose writer, Sir Philip Sidney. And you know that from your reading of Elizabethan sonnets that he was an Elizabethan sonneteer, and his collection of sonnets was known as Astrophil and Stella. So that was the name of his work. But here he has written this book, Defense of Poesy. And Sir Philip Sidney's work here is kind of a he's trying to sort of defend poetry from the charges that had been laid against it. And this is his work. Now, Sidney actually it consists of this book, a number of literary essays, and the romantic tendency of his age is expressed in this work. Next writer is Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh actually was a kind of soldier and statesman. He fought in wars against the Dutch. Now, one of his, there are two works which we might consider. One is the Discovery of Guyana, and the second one is History of the World. This was written in prison, when he was imprisoned. And now, Discovery of Guyana, actually, which it is an account of his visit to that place, and there are certain colonization schemes, and that has been expressed in this work. So Sir Walter Raleigh's Discovery of Guyana is like that. Next, the work that he had written, History of the World, it is a kind of a work from the creation of the world to the fall of the to the downfall of the Macedonian Empire. And the style of this work is simple and dignified. There are flashes of wit and poetry, and a number of records are there. And in the conclusion to this work, Raleigh apostrophizes death, and he concludes the work, History of the World. Now, John Fox was he was another prose writer of this period, and you will find that John Foxe actually is remembered for his Book of Martyrs. Book of Martyrs, a book that was actually written by Foxe, and he was in fact trying to write something about the English martyrs. And this book, of course, uh, it was an English work, and uh, it was actually there was another work called Acts and Monuments, which was a translation, and that was later called the Book of Martyrs. And of course, this is the book for which he has been known. Now, most of these writers, you will find that they have been forgotten, except Sir Francis Bacon and Sir Philip Sidney. Generally, we do not read about their works nowadays. So they have been forgotten mostly, and it is because we have to study the history of the Elizabethan prose that we have to read about them. Now, William Camden, next one is William Camden, and you will find that William Camden also is a writer who was in fact writing about uh, this um, these works which concern history, and this particular work, Britannia, which was published in 1586, that was in fact a monumental work for him, and his Annals of Queen Elizabeth is also quite well known. It was well known during those times. So he has these two works to his credit. Next comes this writer called John Knox. John Knox he was known as a reformer, that is a religious person, and in his History of the Reformation in Scotland, that is what he has written. And there are accounts of his helpers and his enemies in this work. So it is not exactly a work of history, because there are a number of personal elements, strong likes and dislikes, and it is somewhat an autobiographical work. And there is an account of his famous interview with Mary, Queen of Scots. So these are there. The next one is Richard Hakluyt. Richard Hakluyt actually was a kind of a voyager, and Richard Hakluyt has written, he was a clergyman by practice, and he wanted to achieve two patriotic goals, to promote the wealth and commerce of his country, and to preserve the memory of all his countrymen who added to the glory of the realm by their travels and explorations. And he was interested in the East India Company's commercial activities, and with Raleigh's colonizing plans in Virginia, and with the translation of writers' travels in America. And he read books of voyages in foreign languages, and actually he read certain books, and his all these readings actually were presented in this book called Principal Navigations, Voyages and Discoveries of the English Nation. So it was published first in 1589, and in the second edition it was published from 1598 to 1600. And the first volume tells of voyages to the north, the second to India and the east, and the third to the New World. So this is the work of Richard Hakluyt. Next comes Samuel Purchas. Samuel Purchas, 1575 to 1626. Now this writer is important because when we will be doing Kubla Khan, the poem by Coleridge, we will see how Samuel Taylor Coleridge was reading Purchas's book, Purchas's Pilgrimage, and while he was actually when he had composed Kubla Khan. So this writer is important for that reason, that for Coleridge had made him famous. And Samuel Purchas was also a clergyman, and he continued in the footsteps of his fellow clergyman Hakluyt, and he used some of the unpublished manuscripts of Hakluyt, and he condensed the records of numerous other voyages. The first book that he published was Purchas's Pilgrimage, which appeared in 1613, and the next one, Purchas's Pilgrims, in 1625. So these actually were the famous books, Purchas's Pilgrimage and Purchas his Pilgrims. And the actually these books are quite good guides, and he's not of the same standard as Richard Hakluyt, but he is more accurate, and in terms of literary finish he is quite good. So these two books were really famous during the Elizabethan period, these two prose works, and they continued to be read even during the Romantic period, as you can understand, because even during the Romantic period, writer, a famous poet like Coleridge was reading those books, reading his books, and he was inspired by them. Let us move on to the next slide, and here we have the translators. The translators, and the first one actually is Sir Thomas North. Not Sir Thomas North was actually the person who translated the Roman writer Plutarch's lives of the great Greeks and Romans, and this book was published in 1579. And many of the Elizabethan dramatists and Jacobean dramatists, they read this book. And Plutarch's Lives, that's the translation, and William Shakespeare himself took some of the characters and many of the incidents for his three great Roman plays from this book. And actually Shakespeare's very famous play, Julius Caesar. So the lives of Julius Caesar, Octavius Caesar, and some of the other great Roman emperors were written by Plutarch, who was a Latin writer, who wrote in Latin, a Roman writer. and that was translated into English by Sir Thomas North. So, of course, North's Plutarch and would really give us an idea how much Shakespeare was dependent on these translations. And North's translation, there we find a number of heroic models. And actually, perhaps there was one French writer called Amyot, A-M-Y-O-T, who had translated from the Latin to his own native language, French. And he reproduces the flavor of the original Latin work, with his translations. And as we can see, Thomas North was able to translate from that, perhaps, that book, and quite accurately. And of course, he does it with great skill. So this is the account of the famous translator of the Elizabethan age, Sir Thomas North. Now I will go through some of the writers who were actually, chronologically speaking, they should come a little earlier than these writers. For example, Roger Ascham. Now, Roger Ascham was the representative of the earlier Elizabethan school. Of prose, and he was actually later appointed the tutor to Queen Elizabeth when she was a girl in 1548, and he was the secretary to Queen Mary. And there are two works which he is famous for. One is Toxophilus, which I have mentioned here. Toxophilus, which was published in 1545. This was a treatise in the form of a dialogue, and this was on archery. And the second work was The Schoolmaster. The spelling is a bit different because it is the Elizabethan spelling, The Schoolmaster, which was published in 1570. And this is an educational work, as you can well understand, an educational work containing some ideas that were then fairly fresh and enlightening. So Roger Ascham was a writer who dealt with these themes, and he was a fairly knowledgeable man, and he was someone who had a great enthusiasm for learning. He was fond of learning, and that is why you can find, though he is influenced by some classical models, he has a strong Elizabethan sense of nationality that is there in his works. And in the first book, Toxophilus, which was, as I have said, a treatise on archery, he wrote that, I am quoting, he was writing this English matter in the English speech for Englishmen, unquote. So this was, as he had declared, it was for Englishmen. That was his objective, and it is written in a plain style, but in a very strong language. And he uses the two figures of speeches, that is alliteration which was used by the Anglo-Saxons, and antithesis. Antithesis is, of course, the placing of two contrasting ideas side by side. So, like that, Roger Ascham was doing that. The next writer is John Lyly. John Lyly, he was another prose writer in the Elizabethan age, and he became later on a literary man in London, and he also entered Parliament. His first great prose work was Euphues, the Anatomy of Wit, which was published in 1579. Euphues, the Anatomy of Wit, and the second part of this work was Euphues and his England. So now these works were kind of travelogues, travel romances. And here, what Lyly has done, he has actually taken a young man called Euphues, who is a young Athenian, and he has recounted the adventures of this young man. And the narrative is full of numerous discussions upon many topics. So it was quite popular during the time, and there are certain balanced phrases, intricate alliteration, labored comparisons, which we find in these books. Now, so this is John Lyly, and the last book that we need to mention that has been written by John Lyly, Sir Thomas Overbury. That is the writer we are going to talk about now, Sir Thomas Overbury. And Sir Thomas Overbury was kind of, you can say, a figure at the court of James, King James, who came to the throne after Queen Elizabeth. And this book, Characters, which was published in 1614, actually it is based on the book written by the ancient Greek writer called Theophrastus, and this book has a number of concise or brief character sketches of well-known types such as a milkmaid, a pedant, a franklin, an affected traveler, and they are written from the point of view of the courtier, and they are very epigrammatic and full of conceits and wit. And they have a kind of a very, you can say, penetrating observation and a fine sense of humor. So this is Thomas Overbury, and we are left with a few other writers. Robert Barton, who has written The Anatomy of Melancholy, and The Anatomy of Melancholy was actually first issued in 1621, and it is an elaborate study of melancholy, its species and kinds, its causes, results, and cure. So it is a labored kind of a book, and some writers like Dr. Johnson and Charles Lamb they were influenced by this book. So this was the book by Robert Barton. James Ussher actually wrote Chronologia Sacra. He was came from a Protestant family, and he wrote this book and actually this was a kind of full of sermons and arguments, uh, and it dealt with religious subjects, biblical chronology. Sacra, of course, it is the word from which sacred is derived, that is religious. Chronologia sacra. Next comes Joseph Hall. Joseph Hall is actually was a bishop of Exeter, and Joseph Hall's earlier work was in verse. Now, actually, this Virgi de Marieram was not exactly prose work, so it was not a prose work, but a series of satires in verse. But there are other theological and devotional works that he had written, and they are quite numerous, and they are tracts, sermons, and treatises. We now come to Robert Greene. Robert Greene, of course, is one of the university wits, as you know. You have read about the university wits, and Robert Greene was one of them. Robert Greene's works are Maximilia, Arbasto, Pandosto, Xenophon, and Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit. So these are some of the works for which he is famous. And Robert Greene was a person who actually was he could not, he wrote these works, and he was critical of Shakespeare in his Groat's Worth of Wit. So you will find his criticism of Shakespeare in Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit, and some of his works like Pandosto. This was a work on which Shakespeare based The Winter's Tale, and in this particular book called his conny catching pamphlets, his knowledge of the London underworld is mentioned. And as I have mentioned, in Groat's Worth of Wit, he actually appealed to his friends, and he was critical of William Shakespeare. The last slide I have is of Thomas Lodge, who was also a university wit, and his works are Rosalind, Euphues' Golden Legacy. And this is a kind of a mixture of monologues and mannerisms after the manner of John Lyly. Thomas Nash, The Anatomy of Absurdities, he is another prose writer. 1589, Pierce Penniless, his Supplication to the Devil, Christ's Tears over Jerusalem, Terrors of the Night, or a Discourse of Apparitions, Lenten Stuff, which deals with some of the underworld of London, and the most famous work, The Unfortunate Traveller, or the Life of Jack Wilton, which was published in 1594. It is a kind of a story which is set in Italy, and it is a historical account of a young adventurer, and it carries the reader all over Europe and makes him witness the chief events of the first half of the 16th century. And the story ends in Italy, and as you can see, he was a person, that is this person called Thomas Nash. He ends this story with a kind of a revenge. And the last one is Thomas Dekker. Thomas Dekker was a person who succeeded Greene and Nash as a prose writer. And The Wonderful Year, that was published in 1603. and which was the year of Elizabeth's death and a bad plague year. And the Bellman of London, he continued Green's Revelations of London's Underworld, The Seven Deadly Sins of London, and News from Hell, brought by the Devil's Carrier. But he is known for his The Gull's Horn book, which actually he was offering advice, education of the gull. Gull means a person who came from the country to the city of London and who was supposed to be duped by the the people, clever people of London. So this is, in short, the Elizabethan prose writers, and I will stop sharing this PPT with you. So these are a number of prose writers that we have to remember, and so I end this class here today.